Hi, my name is Cindy Rang with the Fabric Patch in Ephrata, Washington. You can find us at fabricpatch.net. My daughter and I have a quilt shop in the centermost part of Washington State. We also have an online store. And we have this YouTube channel. So if you're new here, you can hit the subscribe button and never miss anything. And if you are somebody who's watched us quite a bit, you'll notice that today is just a little bit different format from what we normally do. We have lots of tutorials, blocks of the month. We do box openings, we do a little fabric chat, we do different tours, quilting cruises, all kinds of things. And normally our little classes are maybe about 15 to 20 minutes. But we did a Zoom class that was 3 one-hour classes. And Anna, our video tech, kind of squinched it all together for you. So you'll see that it's a little bit different. There's a whole lot of chit chat that I do and far more description and demonstration than what we've done in previous classes. I hope you like it. I hope you think that this format is okay. There's lots of Zoom classes that we were doing during the shutdown, and we have other footage like this, then we can scrunch it together if you feel like you like that. If you want something that's pretty simple, down and dirty, 5 minutes, this will not be that video. If you really want somebody to show you trimming, pressing, all of the math and information about sashing and borders and perfect points, then this might be the right video for you. So what we're doing is the Navajo Rose. This is one of our patterns. We have over 250 patterns. And the quilt that we made in the class is this quilt that I'm standing in front of. So one thing to know is that we had everybody pre-cut all of their pieces before we started. So you'll see that I get right into piecing. And the other thing to mention is that I mentioned in the class to not cut your sashing pieces until you've pieced your blocks. And in this series, you'll see why I say that. So anyway, I hope you like it and enjoy. All right, so what we're going to start with is we're going to start with making our half square triangle blocks. What you can do is put your ruler down point to point and mark a line. Once you've drawn your line, now what I'm going to do is just come over to the sewing machine. I am sewing 1/4 of an inch away from that line. So I've sewn on both sides. So this is an easy way to make a half square triangle block, because then all I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it apart right on this line. And I do tend to use my ruler, although if you're not exact, it's not going to matter so much. It's just your seam allowance. And then when you press them open, let's talk about pressing for just a second. When you press them open, I tend to press to the dark. So what I'll do is I put my light down. Get that out of the way. And then what I'll do is I just rock over, because what's important about pressing is it's important that you get this seam pressed all the way open so that your block, which I think is supposed to be 4.5 inches, is truly 4.5 inches. Okay, so the other thing is if you already have this quick quarter ruler, so what happens with these is what you do is you lay this down. This is right in the point. And then I'm going to come right down the center, and just make sure I'm right in the point right there. And then I just kind of like to do dash marks, but you can also, if you'd rather, just draw a line. It doesn't really matter. It's not like you're going to forget what you're doing. And then it's the same thing. So instead of trusting that I drew my line and I was sewing 1/4 of an inch away, this is showing you the exact line that you're going to sew on. So I'm going to sew on this line right here, come right around and sew on that line. So that's the only difference from doing it this way and just drawing the line and sew your 1/4 inch. One other thing I want to mention are the little dog ears.
And the dog ears, if you look at your half square triangle, it's that weird little flap left over. Can they see that? It's that little thing right there. You want to snip those off. This is Brittany's wonderful little pile of her half square triangle blocks. So she's got all of hers done and all of hers pressed and all of her little dog ears all clipped off. So we're going to set those aside, and I have the 4 that I've chosen. And again, they're all going to be seen all at the same time. And so it doesn't matter. So I'm going to lay these out. And then you're going to choose more of your flower petals. That's why you need so many of these, twice as many of these, because then what you're going to do is just choose something that will go with one of your half square triangle blocks. And so what's going to happen is when you put these down right sides together, you're going to immediately notice that, of course, this block is 1/4 of an inch bigger or 1/8 of an inch bigger all the way around. The reason that we did that on purpose, because we know that when you made this half square triangle block, we knew the size that this was going to be. And we could have said, and for your next piece, cut it a different size, cut it the size that it would fit. What happened is it's just, I think, a recipe for disaster where people will choose the wrong one. The block is the wrong size. I cut the wrong size. And so it's just a little bit easier to trim up the block afterwards so that all of your petals are cut at the same time. So if that doesn't make sense, it will in just a second. So I just want to show you that when you lay this right sides together, that petal block is going to be 1/8 of an inch bigger all the way around. Just go with it. It's a good thing. So we're going to lay that down. And then what we're going to do is we can see our seam allowances going this way, right through the center. We're going to make, just like we did our half square triangle block, we're going to do that again and make a 3/4 block. And so whatever you'd like to do, again, if you would like to use your ruler or your quick quarter ruler, you're just going to put your ruler down, draw your little line, do the exact same thing. So okay, so it'll look like this. And after I've cut this in half, I'm going to press it open. I'm going to do that same thing. So this is what your block will look like, right? So when we've done this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to trim these down now to 4.5 inches. So of course you've got this excess on this edge that's left over because this block was bigger than your half square triangle. So this is just a tiny little mat. And this mat, I think, is like 10 by 8 or something like that. And so if you do not have a rotating mat, your mat will turn easily on a mat. So if you happen to have just a fun little travel mat, or I think these are what, like $10. And so if you don't have it in the budget yet for a $40 rotating mat, if you have a mat when you're trimming things and you don't want to be repositioning, this actually works pretty well. So the other thing is, if you have a smaller ruler that you're going to use for trimming up to your 4.5 size, what I do, and if you've watched any of our other classes, we like to use this wet erase marker. And so it's kind of nice because if you're making your marks are not going to come off on top of your fabric, and they're not going to come off on your hand. As soon as you're done with the marks, I am super gross because I just lick my finger and wipe it off. But if you're a little tidier than that, you can grab a paper towel or something and go ahead and wipe off your ruler. So anyway, so what we're going to do is I have marked my ruler. I don't know if you can see it. So I've counted down my 4, is there a glare? How's that? Is that better? 4.5. And I've put a little mark right here. And I tend to come in just a little bit because I don't want it to obliterate that line that I'm lining it up. So I've got a 4.5 marked here. I have it indicated over in the center. I don't know if you can see that right there. And then up here, I have another little mark. Now, the other mark we're going to want to know is we're going to want to know the center. So this one happens to be 4.5. You can do the same trick if you're doing a tri-dazzle and you're doing an 8-inch block or whatever. But for us, since it's 4.5, we know half of 4.5 is 2 1/4. So I'm going to find my 2 1/4 inch mark, and I'm going to put a mark right where that is. So it is 1 2 1/4, 1 2 1/4. It's right there. 1 2 1/4, 1 2 1/4. I'll hold that up. Can you guys see that? So it's right there. All right, and this is why we want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this up, and let's see, can you see there? Yeah. All right, so if you can see that, so I'm going to trim this block to 4.5. So I can see that 4.5 is right here, 4.5 is right here, 4.5 is right here. And just to make sure that my block doesn't get wonkadoodle, I'm going to line up that little 2 1/4 inch dot right in the very center of my block. And I'm also watching, this particular ruler has a little 45-degree line, so I can make sure that when I'm trimming my 4.5, I'm right on the point right here. And again, I'm just going to check my little reference points to make sure that I am, there we go, 4.5, 4.5, 4.5, 4.5, and right in the center. And I'm gonna have to stand up to cut. Isn't that weird that there's certain things? And so, and if you find that something is off just a little bit, and for some reason you have to scooch something over, make whatever decision you have to make. These are just your reference points. So you're okay. It's just good to be able to make whatever decisions you want to make while you're doing it, so that you have all of your points where you want all your points to be. So once you have it the way you like, and I'm going to tell you right now, you're probably not going to trim much off of your half square triangle sides. You're going to do most of your trimming off of your big triangle side here and here. And the other thing too that I want to mention is look at the amount. In fact, I'm going to cut this. Look at what we've cut. A little bit up here and very little down there. And that's that whole reason for going ahead and keeping that larger petal size, because it's a whole lot easier to be able to trim off that little bit of extra rather than wishing that I had just a little bit more and my block is a little bit too small. So I'm going to trim off the side and the top, and again, probably not too much. And then I'm just going to turn my mat so that then all I have to do is lift up my ruler, turn it, and that way I don't have to pick up my block. And then I'm just going to line it up. I've got that same thing. I've got my 4.5, 4.5, 4.5, my little dot right in the center. And again, I'm going to probably cut very little off of this side, a bit off of that side. And here's my trimmed up block. Oh, sorry. And there's my trimmed up block. So I've got all of my points right where they should be. Your goal is to make sure on your little 4.5 marks on your ruler that this comes right off on the point, right off on the point, and right off on the point, so that you have perfect points on your flowers, but you'll be good. So we're going to trim all of those up. On step number 6, it says, cut on the drawn line. These will yield 2 rose petal units. They will be mirror image. Start 2 piles, right and left. And so that's what I mean by that. So when this one was together, like this, how did this one go? No, it went like this.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. It was like this. Okay, so this was my block, right? And so then we cut that and we sewed that. And so what happened is when you open this up, what you'll see is that one of them spins this way and this one spins that way. They're mirror image. So we knew this when we were designing this quilt. We did it this way anyway. You'll see this block done, and I think it's still called, it's a traditional block. It's also called the Desert Rose. They call it different things. But the way that they tell you to do it is they say, cut out these little triangles, cut out these little triangles, cut these big triangles, and sew them together. And if you do that, you are able to keep track of everything so everything flows one way. If you do that when you're cutting out all those triangles, two of the sides that you're sewing will be biased. So it's very, very difficult to keep everything straight, to keep everything the same size, and to have your block lay flat and your quilt lay flat. So we tend to not like to do that, even with a lot of starch. So that's why we stack our squares, sew and cut, stack our squares, sew and cut. And that's why we've ended up with mirror image blocks. So all that means is when it's time to sew them together, you want to make sure that you know that these four, and see the difference? So these four, and whether you want to call these your left-handed ones because they're going this way, or your right-handed ones because they're going that way, it doesn't matter. You just want to know that you're keeping these four, or 24, however many you have, in one pile. And then, so all of these are all spinning the same way. And then all of these will be in a different pile. Because then when it comes time to put our blocks together, we're pulling all from the same pile. So that's what I've done here. Is we have two different
Mom,
ones. Yeah.
I just want to point out to the top two squares that you have pinned up, one is a left and one is a right.
So do you guys see what she's talking about? So see this block and see that block? They're opposite. Do you want to zoom in on that maybe? So see this one, see my big triangle size here? This one is spinning this way. See that? And then look at this is the opposite block, and see that one? Big triangle block, it's spinning this way.
Oh, okay.
So if you were to look at, and if you look, let's look back over at this quilt for a second. No one ever notices that. So it's not wrong. At first, when we started doing this, people said, well, what do? Do we make the blocks? Then we have 18 for one quilt and 18 for another? It's like, absolutely not. You put them all in the same quilt, but you would never really notice that half of these blocks are spinning one way, this one's spinning this way, this one's spinning this way, and half are spinning the other way. You don't notice it. So half's doing one thing, half is doing the other thing. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of it. The reason you have to be aware of it, so let's go back over to this board, is that if you start to put your blocks together, so these four, see, are all going the same way. If something happens and you get a little bit mixed up and you throw one of these guys in, your block will not look right. It'll start to spin and then something weird will happen. So you just have to make sure that you're doing all your left-hand blocks first, then all your right-hand blocks. The next step is to take piece number, is it D? It's D. D. Background pieces. And so what you'll do is, if you end up sewing it on the other side, it's not that big of a deal. I tend to like it on the big side. So do you see what I mean by that? This is the small triangle. This one is the big triangle. So I sew it on this side, but what has to happen is your backgrounds have to be touching. So what I mean by that is that you would put this on right sides together right here so that these guys are touching, and you're going to sew it right there, not down here. And I would say not over there. So put them on right here. They should fit perfectly. 3.5 by 4.5, and you're going to sew all of those on. Is take 4 of your left-handed blocks and sew your background to that bigger side up here. And then take 4 of your right-handed blocks. And that's what you'll have. Sew those on, press them open, sew those on, press them open. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. What you need is piece number, did we decide this was piece C?
It was labeled on my bag.
Your center square.
Yes, C.
C. And again, there's no right or wrong. Your center squares can be all the same, all different, fussy cut blocks, whatever you want. One reminder is that if you're going to fussy cut out some squares, which of course means you want to really pick that flower or whatever, just remember that your block is going to be seen on point. And so when you cut it out, make sure you cut it out that way if you want to. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to set these aside for a second. And we'll do these. So what's going to happen is you are going to do a partial seam, because then we're going to come back and it's a kind of like a set seam, but it's a little bit different. So we're going to start right over here in the corner, because again, I kind of like all of my corners of my petals. Oh, here, let's show you on this one. The corners to kind of all come out of the center. I just think it looks more like a flower when it's doing that. So we're going to start right here, and we're going to only sew over. We're going to leave about, I don't know, an inch open. So, because then after we do that and we sew that, I'm just going to pretend that I did it. And again, sewing to right there. Then I'm going to take my next one and I'm going to put it right sides together and sew that whole seam. It'll be about like that. And then I'm going to take my next one, right sides together, sew that whole seam. And then you'll see that that's why we left this open, because then what's going to happen is I'm going to take this last one, get this out of the way. Sew this one on, right sides all the way down. Press that open, and then I'm going to come back and finish that seam. And then sew that one, just right sides together, sew that one. The reason you have to do it that way is just to make sure that everything is spinning around that center block. You'll find other blocks that are constructed this way when they talk about that. And that's what's happening, is you're just going to finish that one. So I'm going to just do it in front of my sewing machine. We'll do them together. And then the other one, it's exactly the same thing. You're just going the opposite way. So you're still going to go ahead, line that up just like that. And then you're going to put right sides together and only sew over about halfway. Then come back, right sides together, sew that one on. Right sides together, sew that one on. Right sides together, sew that one on, getting that out of the way. And then come back and finish that seam. Okay, and now that I have all of that on, I can go back and finish that seam. But what I want to show you is that after your block is pieced, ideally what you're looking for is that you've got that 1/4 inch left between your point and that little bit of background before you get to the edge of your quilt. You've got 1/4 of an inch between the point,
Oh, mm. Oh, that's right.
1/4 of an inch, and sometimes, oh, this one, oh, almost, it's maybe an 1/8 of an inch, and that's okay, no one cares. 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch here. So that's kind of what we're looking for, because when it comes time to sew our sashing in here, we need that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance in order to make sure we have a perfect point. Now, if you don't have to go crazy. You can go ahead, if otherwise it's perfect except for one. You could maybe take a look at that seam right there and just see what might have happened. But if you really do have a 1/4 inch seam, you're not going to fix that. If you go in and just say, well, I'm going to make a deeper cut, well, that could be okay. You could end up on the point, but then your block is smaller here, right? So sometimes it just becomes like, picking at a scab and you end up with something a little bit worse. So let it go. I'm just saying that's kind of what you're looking for, is that 1/4 inch all the way around. And that's why once you're done with that, we don't really recommend necessarily trimming your blocks, because if you trim your blocks, you are probably going to cut those little 1/4 inch bits off. And so we don't want you to do that. But we want to know what size your blocks are. And that's why we don't have you cut your sashing pieces yet.
All right, so friendly little intermission here. If you feel like you've got the blocks down and you fully understand how to do the rest of it, you can skip the last half of the video. The last half is all about sashing and borders, border math, corner setting, side setting, triangles, all of that kind of stuff. So again, I know it is chatty, but keep in mind that each class was an hour. So I was visiting and chatting in front of a big, large screen the entire time I was piecing. And even though Anna is a wizard, she couldn't cut a lot of that out. So again, hope it's all okay. Hope it's not too chatty, but if you're in for it, there's the last half that you can watch.
So let's say that your blocks are 11 inches. Doesn't matter. That's what the size of your sashing strip will be. If it's 11 and a half, doesn't matter. That's what the size of your sashing strip is going to be. But if your blocks were 11 and a half and you had pre-cut all of your sashing strips to 11 and a quarter, something really bad would happen, because then you're a 1/2 inch short, and you don't want to trim those blocks down to 11 and a quarter because you would lose your points, right? So that's why there's a lot of people that like to pre-cut all of their pieces first and then sew. And there are certain patterns that you can do that for this particular one. And I think anytime you're making blocks and you're putting sashing and cornerstones, you want to be careful with that. And the other thing that I want to mention is that you might want to use this same setting for other blocks. Maybe there's some Ohio Star blocks or some 9 patches or something else that you just want to do the exact same thing, whatever size those blocks are. If those blocks are 10-inch blocks, 12.5-inch blocks, whatever, the other steps that we're doing from here on out, you can apply the same thing. So let's talk about the sashing then. So the thing with sashing, we talked a little bit about color last time. When you choose your color, sometimes you might want to audition it a little bit. And I don't know, did we show them last time what you picked?
I think we did.
I think we did. And she changed her mind and picked this really pretty purple instead. I think that is going to be way prettier.
Mhm.
Yeah. And sometimes you don't know. I think we talked about that before. It's like moving your furniture on. You have to put it there to decide if you like it there or not. Nope, now we're going to move it again. So, that's kind of nice. So this is the one that she's picked. So we're going to go ahead and cut some sashing pieces. So hers is 11 and a quarter. And I think that I said, didn't I say 2 inches? I think I said 2 inches. And again, the idea with sashing, that is just the world according to me. It means absolutely nothing. If you feel like you want your quilt to be a little bit bigger and you want your sashing to be 2.5 inches, sometimes I'll do a sashing with 3 inches. If you watched Brianna's tri-dazzle, what was that, 1.5 inches she cut?
Yeah.
So it was a 1 inch finished. Sashing is kind of whatever you want. The idea with sashing is that it separates the blocks, adds a little bit of color, and it'll add a little bit of size. So I said to cut it 3 inches wide, which will give you a 2.5 inch finished. So 11 1/4 by 3. We've measured hers and that was perfect. So let's talk for just a second about the math with your fabric. So your fabric is typically, unless you're using something that's 54 wide, which is really rare anymore, or extra wide, you're going to end up with 42 inches is your width of fabric, right? So if you cut a 3-inch strip and then you turn and cross cut it, your 11 1/4, you're only going to get 3 pieces, and you're going to have this waist piece that's like 8 inches by 3 inches and you're going to have a lot of them. And maybe they'll work for something in the future, but it's kind of an odd shaped piece. And I tend to be very frugal when it comes to fabric. And I feel like I always want to get the best use out of my fabric. So what I would do with sashing pieces that I know that I'm going to cut quite a few of, is I would cut my strip 11 1/4, right? Is that, yeah, 11 1/4. And then I'm going to cross cut 3 inches, because then I won't have any waste at all. Or if so, it will be very, very little. So what I'm going to do is, and I'm going to fold this just so that you guys can see. I can never tell what they can see. Are they good?
I think
They can see what they can see. And this is, again, you know, I tend to not use my mat as a measuring device. Just because it can be off just a little bit. I'm going to come around the other side, because this is how I would do it, is get myself a nice straight edge. And then measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do you want 11? I want the big one, yeah. So you can do it a couple ways. Can I have the small one too? Thank you. So you can do a couple things. Again, for me, I find that if I were just, let me go back for here for a second. If I were going to just line this up on the line, on this line, and count over 11 1/4 and cut that, you know, and measure up what that is and cut right there, you're probably fine. It's probably no big deal. I just find that every once in a while, when I do have some sort of a weird shaped block or something is just off by a little bit, it's always when I did that. So for me personally, I tend to not use the mat. If you find that you have good, consistent results using the mat, you know, whatever you want to do. For me, what I would prefer to do is measure over my 11 1/4. And then if you have a limited number of rulers, you can go ahead and line this up so that you have a nice straight edge. Your other option is if you have a 12 1/2 inch ruler, a square up ruler, then you can use this one. And even though my ruler says 11 1/4, I never know. Every once in a while you have a ruler that has a funny little 1/2 inch on it, or the number is going the wrong way. So I always, force of habit, I always just visually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 1/4. And double check in my head, 11 1/4. Yep, that's the size I want to cut. I'm going to go ahead and cut. And since I know I want a bunch of them, I am just going to do a second one real fast. Line that up because then I can see exactly, I mean, the line is fine, fine, fine instead of a little bit thicker or maybe even kind of partially worn off of my mat. Second one, put this aside for a second. I'm gonna hand that to you for a second. All right, and then what I can do is turn this, and I'm gonna feel confident enough to go ahead and cut 4 layers at once. And I'll do the same thing. I like to start with my nice clean edge. So I'm gonna line everything up, come around, that off. And the reason I just like to come around is because if I pick it up and turn it to the other side, because I'm right-handed, something will get a little bit bajiggity. So then I can line up my 3 inches. Or if you have a shaped cut, you could do this super quick. Okay, so I might have these guys a little too close together. The other thing that's nice about either your design wall or the floor or whatever is you really get to see what it's going to look like. All right, so your sashing is going to look like this, and it looks thicker because of course we've got our seam allowance on there, so it'll end up being 2.5 inches finished. And then next we have our cornerstones. Your cornerstone blocks will also be 3 inches. They will be whatever the size of your sashing is, right? Because otherwise it kind of won't fit. So if you decide to make a thinner sashing or a thicker sashing, whatever you'd like, you just want to make sure that your cornerstones are the same size. So if those were 3-inch wide strips, your cornerstones will be 3-inch squares. So I'm going to cut more sashing, but let's talk about side setting because in order to sew everything together, you do have to make sure you have your corner side setting blocks and your side setting blocks. Couple things about that. One is that you want to know that all of those will be on the bias. So if you look over here for a second, you can see that we put these on. And then I don't know if you can tell or not, but there's a little stay stitch right there. It might be hard for her to zoom into that. But we went ahead and just sewed a little line right there just to make sure that things don't bloom. And that's the problem with bias, right? Is that when you're looking at fabric and you've got your warp thread and you've got your weft thread, and so no matter where you cut, things are going to, you know, stay together. But if you cut on the diagonal and you cut on your bias, there isn't a thread that's running through there. So what happens here on the edge is basically you've got all of these little bits that are, and so there's nothing that's stabilizing that. And there's something called a bloom that happens. And that's literally what happens is that even if you're not manhandling it very much, what will happen over time is it's just going to relax and rest. And so this piece that might be 13, I'm just going to make up a number, maybe it's 13 inches from here to here. Pretty soon it's going to be 13.5, and then it's going to be 14. And then your whole quilt, by the time you get your border on it, it's going to look like this. So what I would say is if you're sewing a quilt in a weekend and you know that you've got your side setting and your corner setting, and then later tonight after dinner or tomorrow morning, you're going to put your borders on, or you know, in 2 days, you're fine. You're fine. Go ahead and cut your border. Don't handle it too much. sew your borders on and you'll be all right. If you feel like it's going to be longer than that, you really do want to put that little stay stitch on there. That's just something that's holding those fibers right where they should be. And that's why people tend to avoid bias. I don't think you need to avoid bias. You just have to be aware of what will happen to it. And so your other option too is to add a whole lot of spray starch, but even that's just that little spray starch, and even best press, it's just a little bit of glue. It's not going to prevent a major bloom. And so you do want to be careful with that. All right. So your side setting, let me talk to you a little bit about the way that we cut that. Because I want to mention that you could make it bigger if you want to. So I want you to see, if you look at the picture.
Is that less than a 1/4 inch?
Seam allowance? No. Yeah, yes, it's less than a 1/4 inch, because if it would have been a 1/4 inch, it would have been right where she's going to sew. This is Brianna's, and she doesn't want to take that seam out. That it's not really a seam, it's just a stitch line. So that's just going to be like in her seam allowance. And so she's going to be sewing though point to point. So yeah, it is less than a 1/4 inch, yes. Okay, so do you notice that I cut that cornerstone? That was just the way that I did it. The way that I've made this quilt, and I've probably made, I don't know, 7 or 8 Navajo Rose. And every time I've made it, I've done it this way. And this is the way that the pattern is written. And so if you look at that, you can see that that cornerstone is cut. And if you're not sure what I mean by that is right up here, when I go to put my side setting in and my corner setting, I have kind of this weird little flap almost that's left. Because for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that off. And so mine is going to finish like this, right? Does that make sense? So that's what I did. And if it doesn't make sense, look at that picture and you'll see that. Now, Brianna has decided that she really likes to see that whole block. So see the difference? Here's her little corner setting. And so, so she likes to see all of it, and she's going to put her border right here to show that whole block, right? Now, what she did for the math was she just went ahead and cut this down so that her sashing strip, she cut it 2.5 inches. So she has a 2-inch finish. So see how you can make it a little bit different if you want to, but you can decide whatever you'd like to do. For me, what we would do for this one is our side setting is the math that we gave you. And so, and we put the math in there. And again, the main reason that we did that is if you decide to do this for future blocks that are 10 inches or 12.5 or 13, you would do the same thing. And so we just told you that your corners, your side setting blocks are roughly what, 7/8 of an inch bigger. And we're going to cut these together, and then we cut them in half, and that's based on your block size. So what happens is some people think, okay, if this is 11.25, I'm going to do another 11.25 because it's the same thing. Cut that in half and put that up there. But what will happen is you don't have that little extra bit that you need to make sure that this comes out to a full point. So that's why you need just that little bit of extra. And then the same thing on the corner. On the corner, we're just cutting 1 block, and we're cutting it in half on both diagonals. So we end up with 4 corners. All right. So let's just look just to make sure that what step is that? I think we're at step number 19. Cut the side setting blocks. They are 3/4 of an inch larger than the Navajo Rose block, which will be 12 inches if your block's measured 11.25. So 3/4 of an inch larger. So again, if you're doing a 12-inch block here, your side setting would be 12 3/4. If you're doing a 13-inch block, 13 3/4. Now, that doesn't allow for this. If you're putting your cornerstones on, just make it bigger. And what I think Brianna's, Brianna made one that was this exact size, and we wrote down her measurements. If you want it to come past with her 11¼ inch block. Her piece G, her side setting, which we say to cut that 12 inches square, she cut that 13¼ And then if you're doing your piece H, your corner setting, instead of cutting that 12½, she cut that 15. So 13¼ and 15. Okay, let's go back to this. And then cut in half on the diagonal. 5 blocks will give you your 10 side setting, and you would need 7 of them to give you 14 if you're making the queen size. And then step number 20 is the corner block, which is 1¼ inch bigger. And this would be 12¼ or 12½ by 12½ based on the 11¼ inch or whatever size it is. Okay, so I'm cutting 11¾ by 11¾ That's what my block size is going to be.
For what?
Side setting,
Okay.
right?
I thought it was supposed to be 12.
12½ I think was your, oh, it was
It's supposed
12.
to be 3/4 inch bigger.
Actually, I think I did cut it 12. I don't know why I said something weird. I did cut it 12.
Sorry, guys.
3/4 bigger, 11, yeah. I don't know, what did I, yeah, I said the wrong thing. I did cut it 12. Let me double check. Yeah, it's 12. Say something. Okay, so here's I have 2 12-inch blocks, and I'm going to cut them in half on the diagonal. So I'm just going to go point to point. Oh, one slipped a little. All right. So that gives me 4 because I've cut 2 blocks. So these are going to go right here. And this will go right here. And again, so this is your bias part, and that's your part with a whole lot of handling. And, you know, this poor quilt, we put it up, take it down, put it up, take it down, put it up, take it down. Without that seam, it would not be the same size. And I only need 1 of these. So I can take this strip and cut it down to a 12-inch block. All right, so for my corner setting, this is my 12½ by 12½ inch block. So this one I'm going to cut on both diagonals. So, and I'm just going to turn it this way so I don't have to move so much. I'm going to lay it there. And then there. And so that's what gives me my 4 corners. So this one goes here. This one is going to go over here. And I've got my other 2 for the bottom, right? Okay, I'm just going to set those there. All right, so I've got, we've got more cutting to do, but let's talk a little bit about how we're going to piece these together. So what happens when we're sewing our blocks together for our quilt, obviously when you're doing squares, you're just going to sew row number 1, sew row number 2, put row number 1 attached to row number 2, and you just keep going on down. This one, since you're doing it diagonal, you're doing the same thing. You're just starting up here and you're working this way. So it does get a little bit tricky because these pieces are faced a little different way. So you do want to make sure that you don't get confused going from here to your sewing machine. So that's why I like to work off of a design wall or off of the floor, you know, off of a big table, whatever you have, so that you can lay it out so that you don't get confused. I'm going to clean up my space here. So you don't get confused when you're going from your design wall to sewing machine. So whether you have clips or pins, it's generally a good idea. And again, I don't tend to be somebody who pins a lot, but for something like this, if this is your first time doing that, you might want to do that. So if this is row number 1, right? Row number 1 is going to sew on to row number 2. This is row number 2. So what I would do first is I would sew my cornerstone to my sashing. Whoopsie. And so this cornerstone right here, and go ahead and press that open, and then I would sew this one. I would go ahead and just kind of sew as I go, but it's up to you. If you want to sew all of your rows together first, so here we've sewn row number 2, and then if we sew row number 3, we're going to do the same thing, right? So this is where I'm saying that whole idea of not getting mixed up. What I would do is I would just take this one, flip it over, right sides together, and I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew that. Now notice you've got this little flappy dog ear left over. Leave that right there. Don't do anything with it. So for right now, I'm just going to come and I'm going to sew that seam so I know exactly where I'm at. And when I'm sewing this row together, I'll probably sew the whole row together and then I'll press. Okay, and then just because I'm real visual, I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to lay this out and go, yep, I got that right. And now I'm going to sew, flip this over right sides together. Line that up and it should line up just perfect. And I'm going to sew that one together. Now for this, I can lay this down this way, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over just so that I can see, because you're able to see. Let's see, can you zoom in? Oh, it's going to be hard to see. Can you zoom into right there? If you look at that, you can kind of see the back side, so you know right where my point is. So as I'm sewing this seam, I'm going to make sure that I'm right where that point is. So that might mean that my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I might fudge just a little, and I might make that seam a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller just to make sure I hit that point. Just because the points are important to me, but sometimes if you do that a lot, you're going to have to deal with that later because of course that's changing the size of things, right? But you know, it's all right. We can fix it with borders. All right, so I'm going to sew this one down. Oh, hey, Brianna's visiting us. Come around and show them. Who's that one?
Grabbed the wrong bag this way. This was Camp Stetters. This is one of my to find for Aaron pile.
Oh,
Hi guys.
We have a friend, a quilting friend who had passed away, and she left a bunch of unfinished quilt tops. So we went over and rescued all of them, and we've been slowly finishing them for the family. So this is
still one to be.
Oh, beautiful. So it's quilted, but needs binding. Oh, really pretty.
Yeah.
So see, this is the same thing. We talked about the difference, and if you want to cut that off or leave that open, this is beautiful.
Yeah, so this is one of my binding ones to bind.
Yeah.
So I had to come back for batting and figured, oh,
Oh, bring it.
Might as well
to
bring some
see.
show and tell.
Show and tell is always really nice.
Yeah, it's
That's
really pretty,
beautiful.
very rich.
Yeah, really rich. Gorgeous. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right. Back to my sweatshop.
Back to you. Oh,
I'm
we'll take it
sorry.
with you.
Sorry, Brittany.
It's okay. Yeah, she's in one day. You took in
Quilting.
like
Oh,
20.
Yeah.
I know.
and in
Yeah.
2 weeks we're moving, so because Mom should be out of my house by 2
I'm
weeks.
at her house. Well, I will be. I'm not yet.
Not yet. But alrighty. Happy sewing.
Yes. All right. So now my points are all good. I'll press those open. So then, thanks, Brianna.
You're welcome.
So then same thing. I'm going to press afterwards. I'm just going to go ahead and lay that up there. And here's my next one. Just going to bring this over. Right sides together. And this sashing, it makes a little bit more sense where you're putting that. But if you're just in the habit of doing that, you won't get these turned around. Because I guarantee when we do this as a class in the shop, every single time, every class, one person will sew that on turned. And so it's just a good way to kind of just keep it straight. Okay, so same thing. I'll press at the end of my row. I'm going to hold this up here. And then I can see that this goes right sides together. And again, when you get down here to the end, you're going to have that funny little dog ear left over. Just leave that. So I'm going to line that up. I don't have any quarter inch points to worry about. So I'm just going to sew this on. And now I would press it. And what I would do, since I have a nice white background, or Brittany does, I'm going to press to the dark. I'm going to press those over first. Press these over. And flip it over. Just make sure. Okay. So now again, whoops. What you could do, typically what I'll do is then I'll go ahead and sew what would be row number 4. So I would sew, my cornerstone to my sashing strip, to my cornerstone, to my sashing strip, all the way down, press those, put those up, sew these, and that same thing. That's just where you're kind of working off of your table or off of your design wall to make sure that you flipped it correctly. Sew that whole row. We're just going to pretend that I have these cut, and we would have a cornerstone, sashing, cornerstone, sashing, cornerstone. Sew all of those on. And then all of a sudden you get to the other corner again. And then it's going to go the other way and you're flipping. So anyway, once you get that, then what's happening is then you're just going to sew these rows together. So for this one, I just want to show you when you sew on your first one. Can we come to the table? So what's going to happen now, if you've decided that you want your cornerstones to be shown, to be seen, like Brianna's Christmas one or the one that we showed with Kim, then this is going to come out all the way past to the end. But for this one, we're going to cut these in half. So what we're going to do is we're just going to line this up. And sometimes you can kind of see visually where it is. If you're not sure about that, the other thing that you can do is press this over and put a little finger press so you have a little line. There's my little line. I'm not sure if you can see that or not.
Yes, we can.
Can you? And then we bring this over, finger press it. So there's my center. There's my center. I'm going to line those up. I'm going to put a pin or a clip right there. And I'm going to sew that on. And you'll do this, all 4 of your corners are going to be a little bit strange because it sort of like goes to nowhere, you know. Sew that down. And what you could do, again, you could press as you go, but what I'm probably going to do is just keep sewing my rows on and then I'll press the whole quilt at the end. But let's go ahead and come back to the, and let me show you your next. Whoops. So now I'm going to flip it over so you guys can see it a little bit better. So if we look here, so now what we see is we have all kinds of things going on, right? So this particular block was just a skosh bigger than that 11 1/4. And you can see that because I have a little extra room right here, but I want to make sure that I don't lose my points. But sometimes you might have some decisions to make. I'm good down here. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to clean this up. Oop, did I move it totally out of the shot? Of course I did. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look. So if you take a look at this, what you can see is I can see that I've got a perfect 1/4 inch here. I'm good over here. It's just this tiny little, I'm off by like 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to cut off my dog ear here, cut off my dog ear, clean this up just a smidge. And I can also see that when I sew this here, my 1/4 inch is in far enough. Can you guys see that? Can they see that very well? Can we zoom into right there?
Sorry, guys.
It might be hard to see because it's dark.
I think they can though.
Can you see it? I'm going to point with this. So you can see that I've got about 1/8 of an inch where I don't have quite enough of my sashing by 1/8 of an inch. But if I'm doing my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I've still got enough of it in my seam allowance. So I'm going to call that good. I'm not going to sew, dip in and catch my 1/4 inch seam allowance and dip back up. I'd have a weird pucker that I'd never be able to get rid of. The reason we want that 1/4 inch seam allowance is mostly almost 95% of it is because of math. The other 5% of it is because we want to make sure there's enough in the seam allowance that nothing is going to come out. We're going to quilt over the top of this. We're going to have other seams here. I'm not going to worry about that. This is not going to come out. I've got at least 1/8 of an inch, so I'm going to call that good. Every once in a while, I'll see little things like this on my quilt, and it's okay. It's all gonna, you don't have to rip anything out. You don't have to start over. You don't have to have an odd piece in there. So I'm going to cut off my little dog ears. So see, now you can probably see a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my 1/4 inch. I'm not going to dip in. I'm just going to sew right about there is where my seam allowance is going to be. So I'll be all right. All right. So I'm going to show you what that's going to look like. So now when I go to line this up, what's going to happen is I'm going to nestle my seams. So see, when I line this up, this is going to line up perfectly there, and this one is going to line up perfectly right there. So I'm going to do is flip this over so that as I am nestling And you guys all know what nestling your seams is, right? That one is going to come one way and one's going to come the other way, and it's just going to lock in there. So it's, and even though I've pressed it one way, I'm going to move this one over just so that that will lock that seam. And people will ask all the time, well, gosh, but you went this way with that one and this one is going that way. And so you might have a seam that's doing something weird in there. Nobody cares about that because that's just the inside of your quilt anyway. No one's ever going to see it. And it's going to have all of that batting with it. So no one will ever feel it either. It's more important for you to be able to make sure that that locks up perfectly. So I'm going to lock that one in place. And I do put a little, again, I'm not so much a pinner, but I do want to make sure that I have specific reference points that need to match up. So I am going to pin those, because then if I have to ease in a little bit, just to make sure that that stays flat and these end up here and here, it's easy to do that. All right, so I'm going to go to the sewing machine. The other, just another little quilting tip is that if you have something that you have to ease in, because every once in a while we have a piece that is, one piece maybe is a little bit longer than the other piece and we have to kind of make them fit. The piece that is bigger, have that one on the bottom, because what will happen is those feed dogs are going to be pulling that through, but you can kind of pull that top one just a little bit more, if that makes sense. So always make that bigger piece on the bottom and it'll work a little bit better if that's something that you have to do. And that's what's nice about, you know, really with your fabric anyway, is that if something didn't come out exactly the right size, you know, it's relatively fluid. And so you can easily make it work. All right. So then what's going to happen is then I'll go ahead and press that. Maybe I'll just give it a really quick, just so you can see it and it'll hang on the board a little bit better. All right. So now it's just repeat, 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 right? So we've sewn this one together. We're going to sew that one on. Sew this one together in whatever order you want to, because then once you have your whole quilt top done, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about borders. So we will review about trimming. But what's going to happen is when you see this edge over here, in fact, let me bring this back to the board and I'll show you. You have extra, and you don't want to trim this as you go. You want to wait until you have your whole quilt top done, because I'm going to show you a couple of tricks about this. But what's going to happen is you're going to line up. You'll have 1/4 of an inch past, and you can see sometimes I'm cutting off this much. I'm cutting off the half of my cornerstone, and look over here. Not cutting off quite as much at all. Because again, if you're easing things in, so make sure that you get everything sewn together. And then what will happen is you're going to give yourself that 1/4 inch. We'll trim all the way around, and then we'll add on our borders. And I tend to suggest 2 borders, 3 borders. And I almost always, my outside border, I feel pretty strongly that it should be whatever your sashing is, because I think that way you can kind of see that everything is outlined. If you don't put this color on the outside edge, then really what you see is that you see that like almost argyle kind of pattern. You know, that's really what you see is that window pane pattern. So I feel like this should be on the outside edge. All right. Okay, so anyway, so if you have these funny little flicks out here, that's what they're supposed to be out there, and we're going to cut those off. Let's talk for just a second about borders. So the first thing with borders is, of course, deciding your colors. And so for me, and again, this is just, it's not really a rule, but what I tend to do consistently is that if I have a sashing, I will put that sashing on the outside also, because otherwise when you look at that, you see that very plaid look. But when you put this on the outer edge and you have it as a border that's going to do that, then it looks more like it's just surrounding the block and you don't see that other plaid quite so much. I'm going to pin this up here so you guys can see it. The other thing is that if you have a directional fabric, you have to decide what you want to do with your directional fabric. And I have to say that over the years, what I have done is I've decided to ignore directional fabric for the most part. If it's like a large block, like in the Stars and Stripes quilt, then I will obviously make sure that those all go the right way. But otherwise with fabric, if it's something that is going to be pieced throughout, I'm just going to guarantee that one of those is going to be upside down. It just doesn't matter. I don't know how it happens, but no matter how careful you are, all of a sudden something gets flipped. So I just go with it and I let some are upside down, some are right side up. They're all over the place because I don't know how this quilt will be on the bed. And that way it's not going to matter how it goes on the bed. But if you have things where there's words and with borders, it's fairly easy because you're really looking at 4 pieces. So if you want your border to be all going one direction, that's not so difficult to do. So when I audition, I always, again, I put my sashing as my outer sashing. It's also known as your first border, so whatever you want to call it. And then beyond that, borders are, there's 2 reasons for borders. One is color and one is size. Other than that, it doesn't matter. So you can do just one. If all you're really going to do is finish this up and maybe hang it up, or finish this up and put some minky on it and put it on your couch, you don't need a whole lot of borders. If you have a bunch of leftover fabric and you really want to get it to queen size, or you really want to get it to king size, you can keep adding borders to that. There's different formulas for how your borders should be measured, but I don't really care that much about it. For me, when I'm figuring it out, some people will say if this one is 2, the next one should be 3, the next one should be 4, and that you should go up in border size. I don't know why that matters. What I'll do is I'll figure out the size I want my quilt to be. And so if I want my quilt to fit on a bed, and I think, did we show you guys how to measure a bed? If you were going to make this specifically, let's pretend that this is my bed right here. What I would do is I would take a 120-inch tape measure and I would hang it down on this end of the bed, and I would go however far. So maybe I want it to go all the way down to the floor, or maybe I want it to hit right at the edge of the mattress so that it's not touching the floor, wherever I feel like it needs to be. And then I'm going to come over to this side, and on the opposite side of the bed, I'm going to hold it down to the same size, so that then when I hold on to that, I can lift this up and say, okay, so I need 92 inches in width. And then I'll do the same thing with the length. I'm going to lay this whole thing out. I'll decide if I want a pillow tuck or I want it to be underneath, come down to the end of the bed right where I want it to be. And then I'll say, oh, okay, I need it to be 102. So if I need it 92 by 102, write that down, measure what my quilt is. And maybe I know exactly that I need 20 inches all the way around. So if I need 20 inches, I know that I need 10 inches worth of border here and 10 inches worth of border here. And then I can decide from there. Okay, so if I need 10 inches, maybe I'm going to do 2, 4, and 4, or 3, 3, and 4. It doesn't really make any difference. It's all about size and color. You can do a border where you're just doing one big large piece, but oftentimes when you do that, it doesn't look right. The reason it doesn't look right is because if you just have this great big massive expanse of fabric, it looks like you didn't make enough blocks, and you just want to make sure that the quilt is big enough. So if you have 12 inches worth of fabric and one border is just, it doesn't quite look right. But if you have 12 inches within, you know, 3 or 4 pieces of fabric, it looks great. It looks correct. We did a YouTube video, and maybe we could link that. And it was all about borders, and there's a whole bunch of show and tell and a whole bunch of descriptions, and it talks a lot about this measuring and how to do this. So it's very specific and covers all of it. Because the other thing about borders, the other thing that's important to know, and we talk about it in that other video, is that you have to measure your borders and put them on so that your quilt stays square. So let's say that on this particular quilt, I'm getting ready to put my borders on, and from here to here, I am 64 inches. And then I measure over here from this edge to this edge, maybe I'm 65 inches. I need to make sure that both ends are exactly the same size. So what I'll do is I will cut 2 pieces that are 65 inches, and I'll show you in a second how to do that. Because then when I sew that on, the width down here is 65 and the width here is 65. Do you have to interrupt me? No. And then I'll press it and I'll measure, and I'll do the same thing for the other side. Sometimes I'll measure in the center also, but only if I'm really nervous about something weird happening. Normally, the center, it's going to be okay. But so maybe the same thing, maybe I've got 88 inches on this side and I've got 87 on this side. And I'll cut 2 pieces that are 88 inches so that, again, when I go to quilt this, it stays square. And we talk about that a lot in that video, and how if you don't do that, it will increase exponentially and you end up with this really weird, strange, uneven quilt, which maybe on a bed, it won't matter that much, but what will happen is you never know what somebody's going to do with your quilt. They might hang it on a wall, they might do something different with it, hang it up outside at a family picnic, and then you'll see, gee, it doesn't hang straight at all. And if you're going to take it to a long arm quilter or long arm quilt it yourself, it won't load on the long arm properly if one side is a lot longer than the other side. So it is important to keep your quilt straight and to square it up. So the way that we do that, let me just show you really quick. I should have had, you had me, can you reach that piece of watercolor fabric? I'll show you a little trick. Thank you. All right. So when you're cutting your borders, the other thing to keep in mind is that if you're figuring a 2-inch border, of course, what you're cutting is 2.5, right? Because for every strip, every border, you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on one side and a 1/4 inch on the other. So add that 1/2 inch. Otherwise, if you're figuring 10 inches and you really cut your strips 2, 4, and 4, you're going to end up about 1.5 inches short. Okay, so let's cut our strips. So let's decide that I'm going to walk over on this side. So we have cut our borders. Okay. So maybe what I need to cut for borders for this, maybe I need to cut 8 strips. And what I usually figure out is I know that I've got about 40 inches of usable space. And so if I have 60 and 60 and 80 and 80, and I can add all of that up and divide by 40, but really I just kind of do it in my head. So if I've got a 40, a 40, a 40, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I know I need 7 strips. I almost always will cut an extra one just to make sure that I have enough. Then what I do is I sew them end to end. So people will talk about this all the time and say that when they sew them diagonal, so that the seam goes like this. And you can do that. The reason that you do that is because then you don't have all of your bulk in one area. The other thing is that for some reason that diagonal seam, you just don't notice as much, but it doesn't really matter. I would say that the majority of the time, I actually just sew them together straight. So what I do is I sew all of my, what did we decide I needed? 8. I'll take all 8 strips and I sew them all together, end to end to end to end, cut off your selvage. So you have this big long, what would it be, 320-inch strip. Then what I'm going to do, so let's pretend that I've done this. And so this is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is all 8 strips. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them and I'm going to bring my end together, almost like when we were doing the jelly roll race, almost kind of like that. And as I've put it together, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, cut off my 2 ends so that my selvage, my end, I have everything nice and even here. And then I'm going to go ahead and take my tape measure and I'm going to measure, because if we decided that I needed, what was it, 64? I'm just going to make it up there. It was 64 inches is what we needed for this side and for this side. And I'm cutting 2 strips at once. So I'm just going to go ahead and lay this down right on the end here, and I'm going to run 64 inches. And again, since I've got 320 inches, I'm just going to run this all the way down. And then as soon as I get to where 64 is, I take my ruler, put it right on top of it. And as soon as I know right where I'm at, then I just go ahead and slide this out so it's out of the way. And then we go ahead and cut that. And when I cut that, sorry, my thumb is, then I have my 2 border strips that are exactly the same size. And so then what I'll do is I'm going to pin it to one side and pin it to the other side. And when I put on borders, I do pin. I tend to be somebody who doesn't pin very much, but when it comes to borders on a quilt, I'll put one end down and I'll pin at the end, pin in the center, and then I'll go ahead and just put in however many 2 or 3 pins just to make sure that everything is right where it needs to be on both ends. And then when I sew it together, I usually sew it together from this side so that I can see where that is, so that I end up sewing right in the point. And I think we talked about that last time when we talked about where we were sewing that. All right, so anyway, that's how I put borders on. So I'll do and I tend to do the short ends first and then the long ends, but there's not really a rule with that. And I'll add on however many borders I want to get it to the size that I want and add the color that I want.
Thank you so much. If you've made it this far, then maybe the classroom setting, in-depth instruction was not so terrible. We do feel like there's a need for this for people who are beginning quilters and they don't maybe have a quilt shop near them. Maybe you think it was a little too much, and fast forwarding through a lot of that was tedious. Maybe put in the comments what you think, and it'll help us to produce more videos in the future for things that you'd really like to see. So again, thank you so much, and stay tuned. We've got a few pictures to share with you in a little photo gallery format of other people that completed these quilts in the class. So thanks again for watching. Thank you for watching our video. We invite you to leave a comment, hit the like button, or better yet, subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. You can also visit our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or Pinterest pages, or find all of those things and our online store at fabricpatch.net.